Go. Oh, stop. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer from Off Planet Media, and Dani Katz from DaniKatz.com is with me. And there is lots to talk about. So let's just get straight to it. Dani, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Another week. I don't know what the week this is. Like we're going into something like the 11th week of.
I'm not counting. Counting feels like a program. I'm not. I refuse.
Counting is a program. It is. It's like a cyclical program. Absolutely. I'm not sure what it is.
It legitimizes it. Like I won't do it.
All right. Okay. All right. So we're not counting, and lots of topics have come up since the last show, which was awesome, by the way. I really enjoyed that one, and we got a lot of good feedback from people on it. And I guess we can kind of pop in, like you have a couple of topics that you wanted to talk about, and the one that kind of popped up for me as a good one for us is this issue that I've been having with Google. Now, obviously, we know Google is, not a free information search engine in any way.
Do you use Google? Like, do you legit use that as your search engine?
No, I use it on my phone. Like, when I'm just like, when in conversation, right? If I'm hanging out with somebody and when in conversation about something and I'm just trying to like get a baseline for something in any way, like I've always used Google. I mean, I'm not a person who does like hours and hours and hours of painstaking research in the same way that like a regular researcher does. I kind of get an idea for something, use my intuition to it, and then go after it from a certain angle. And I've always found that I can usually find my way to what I want, even if I have to use Google. I use some other search engines, but even some of them are starting like DuckDuckGo or Bing sometimes, but those aren't perfect either. I recognized at a certain point with DuckDuckGo that something had really shifted. But because of the way I search for things and I put together unusual search terms and whatnot, I'm usually able to sort of find what I'm looking for to do things the way I like to do them. But what happened, so no, I don't rely on Google as a great search engine for doing research, but because of the method that I use, I've usually been able to find myself to the information I'm looking for, oftentimes by going to the later pages of the search, right? So I was on my phone last week. A couple of times this happened, and I just put in something to search, like I said, in the process of conversation, not sitting down to deep dive into something. And whenever I put up anything that had any like importance or anything at all, I wouldn't even say anything controversial, just anything that is actually in some way important, I would only I'd get like a page of results, and then it would say, if you want to look at the omitted results, you can click on this, and I did, and it'd give me like maybe one page more, and then there'd be a box saying that like you can send an inquiry to Google for like a better, so we can have a better search or whatever, but then that was it. There was no more like, okay, I have to dig to the 20th page because they're trying to bury stuff. There's no 20 pages anymore. There's like 2, unless you're looking at something like completely dumb, like, Madonna videos or whatever, right? It's just this completely reduced set of information now, as opposed to like putting the things that are mainstream or quote unquote authoritative sources first. It's just completely contracted now. Have you seen this?
I haven't seen this because I don't use Google, but I'm not surprised. I mean, Google's owned by Alphabet, and Alphabet's whole thing is this global vaccination that they're working with the Google techs to give us. And given that they pulled their bullshit fake event in March to drive the vax thing forward, because let's not kid ourselves, like that is the end game. Yeah. Like I'm not shocked that all of a sudden Google is amped up their censorship. Everyone's amping up their censorship right now. We are living in a fascist police state. So it's sucky. I'm sorry to hear it, but I'm not surprised given the way everything's going.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not surprised. It was just, you know what I mean? Like, there is nothing about it that surprises me, but it was literally just like something that all of a sudden one day happened and I haven't heard anybody speak about it. You know what I mean? What search engine do you use? Because I mean, for me, short of like starting to learn to use the dark web or whatever, I don't think there are any actual opens, like, completely censorship-free search engines anymore, are there?
Well, I just downloaded a new one. I've been using DuckDuckGo, and like you, like I get that there's something funky about it. Yeah. There's one that starts with like, I want to say an H. It's like a single syllable word. I'm looking for it now, but now might not be the most opportune moment to do it.
Yeah.
But I also get what, like, I don't want to be completely, like, I'm compassionate to what you're saying. Like, it's very weird. Every day there's like a new taste of tyranny. And it's very odd, having lived like as free sovereign people for as long as we have, to make these adjustments. And it's kind of, it's like, oh, there's another blow to our civil liberties, you know. And probably because you and I are at the forefront of searching for things that they're clamping down on the most, especially you, like, we're gonna feel it first before like our friends on the web start bitching about it. So like, I'm sorry that you're on the forefront. Like, I know it sucks. Like, it's so painful to deal with this, but I'm not surprised at all, because the vax thing is just being revved up so ginormous.
Well, like, I'm not like sad, like my feeling, I'm not upset about it. Well, I guess to me, the part about it that is surprising is like, they've been more like, you know, they've tried to portray themselves as free and open source of information, right? Even though you and I have known for a long time that's not the truth. When you deliver somebody hundreds of pages of information with anything that might be important way at the end, right? Then you can sort of, and you know, you're prioritizing shit that you know isn't true, but is the version of reality that you would like people to believe to the front, right? Okay, to me that seems like more of hiding your censorship, right, in plain sight. Whereas
they're not hiding it,
blatant, right? Like, there is that one interview of, I think, Eric Schmidt from Google saying that, like, there should only be one answer. And eventually what we're trying to work for is that you Google something and there's only the one answer, the right answer. So while he's been blatant about it, it was like, this is a huge reduction from like hundreds of pages of options to like 2, right? You know what I mean? And I guess the thing that I'm more surprised about is not that it hasn't, not that it's happened, but that I haven't heard anybody talking about it at all, because you'd think even like normal people who don't do research and aren't used to having to dig to the end of the things might have noticed that it was a little bit shorter than usual.
I think you're giving humans too much credit. B, have you not noticed that these things are happening to you and me first? Like, I still to this day haven't heard of anyone who Gmail is changing their links en route, as has happened to me. Like,
I haven't heard that from anyone else either. Yeah.
You are an alternative media icon. They're going to target you first. Yes, I've decided it. And they're targeting us first. Like, I'm getting fucked with in ways that no one else has noticed. And I think it's going to continue.
Okay, so if anybody else is having this, either can people leave comments in the comment section if anyone else has had any links changed in their Gmail, or if Google has shrunk into this like little tiny thing on your cell phone, either, just to see if maybe we're the only ones, so that we sound like cuckoos while we're out here saying this. But I mean, you know, I'm not surprised, nor am I disappointed. I'm just surprised that I hadn't heard this from, you know, usually I can find the people making YouTube videos about this kind of stuff and whatever. I haven't heard this anywhere. And so I thought that was odd.
Yeah, I think like this stuff is happening at a hyper accelerated rate. And I think because you're in alternative media and because you're probably Googling all the search terms that the algorithm has been, you know, programmed or decided upon itself by way of machine learning to clamp down on, that you're going to be experiencing it first until they kill us. Cancel culture.
Did you come up with the name of that search engine that you were thinking of? It started with an H?
No, I'll find it and I'll send it to you. We can put it in the show notes.
Okay.
I know, but you know that the Dems put through a bill, like it was like a couple days before the Republicans put through their 5G thing, to criminalize and get rid of all encrypted search engines, communication apps, whatever.
Emails, all that kind of stuff. I have heard stuff like that.
It's so weird to me that like the people who are identified with the left or Democrats or whatever, like, don't have any misgivings about this stuff happening. Like, that is what is so weird to me. Like, okay, if we're gonna tackle and like completely shred the First Amendment, don't you think we should do some research into what or why? But it seems like everyone who's like pro censorship, pro masks, pro the eradication of our rights and pro communism also can't be bothered to do any research as to why we're moving into tyranny. And that is like that kind of willful ignorance I'm having a bit of an issue with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will say though, have you seen Matt? I mean, I've always been a fan of Matt Taibbi, but his recent articles are not, he's not talking about encryption. He's on different topics, but he has spoken about some of these issues regarding privacy, especially when talking about things like Julian Assange and whatnot. But I think the reason that we're seeing that right now, that like why no one on the left cares about this thing about encryption and privacy, is because they think that encryption and privacy is how the secret is being kept, that Donald Trump really is in collusion with Russia, right? I think that's what they think. And so by that if people have nothing to hide, right, up to the highest levels, then they should be perfectly fine with, having their door to the door of their house wide open.
I think that you're right. And I've been, and this isn't really the main thing that I want to go into at all, but this was why I wanted to talk about TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, because for the past, probably couple weeks, I'm really examining what is this willful ignorance? What is this refusal to click a link, to look at the information? I was recalling when Alex Jones got kicked off of I think it was YouTube, whatever the big censorship thing was last year. And I was at the Beck concert with a friend of mine who's pretty tried and true, old school Dem. And he was like, well, that's great. I think he should be censored. And I said, well, have you ever listened to him? Have you ever listened to him talk? And he said, I would not waste my time listening to that trash. And my thing was if we're gonna shit all over the First Amendment, then you kind of need to waste your time to see what it is that those who are indoctrinating you are deciding is unfit for your little infant ears to listen to. And so what I've realized in coming up against this willful ignorance again and again and again and again is I do think it's tied into Trump derangement syndrome. And I part of me thinks it's whatever mind control is coming through it that's shutting down the ability to think critically. And also the piece, because it's happening on so many levels, what I'm realizing, because I'm still looking at that pushback at pandemic and why are so many people who are allegedly intelligent refusing to take in the information while just assassinating these people's characters based on nothing. And what I've come to is that a bunch of people have spoken out that if there's any information or trail of information that looks like it might possibly not make Trump look like the devil, then it can't be considered. Because that, whatever that thing is, that Trump derangement syndrome is so big that it doesn't matter if we lose our constitutional rights, if people are muzzled slaves, none of it matters as long as Orange Man stays bad and isn't reelected.
Okay, so I had a lot of thoughts while you were just talking, and one of the things, so I have a thought that's very clear in my mind, and I'm going to try and make it come out of my mouth so that it seems as clear as what's happening in my mind, which sometimes I struggle with.
No, you can do it. You got this.
So when you were talking about the Alex Jones thing, right? So in some ways, the Trump derangement syndrome is an extension of the Alex Jones derangement syndrome, right? So we don't need to go through what the problems are with Alex Jones. We all know what the problems are with Alex Jones. However, it was always this interesting thing going on because people talk about him as being extreme right wing or a conspiracy theorist or whatever, right? And so but one thing, but regardless of whether he's extreme right wing or a conspiracy theorist, if you believe in freedom of information, freedom of speech, being able to form your own intellectual opinion about things, all that kind of stuff, then regardless of what dumb thing he says, right, or whatever, or what wrong thing or anything like that he says, then that still needs to be out there as part of the landscape of information for people to form their opinions about the world, right? And the left was, for so many years, thought to be the protectors of that right, right? The protectors of the free press, all of that kind of thing, because for so many years, the right had been accused of wanting to shut down freedoms out of some sort of like religion, like kind of because of right-wing conservatism and Christian evangelicals taking over the party and stuff like that. So that people thought of the left as being the defenders of that. So Alex Jones, I think, was inserted into this thing, whether intentionally by someone controlling or just whether by the way the world works. He comes in and he starts saying things that are, in a way, part of it is the way he delivers and part of it is the way he mixes information together in some ways, that is getting under the skin of people who formerly were open to the free exchange of ideas, and getting them to be so turned off by a person or the way information is delivered that they're willing to they're willing to like push aside the greater important thing, which is freedom of speech, in order to not have to deal with the discomfort that this particular person or a particular idea he says brings up for them, right? Totally. And so think about, so Alex Jones has been around for a number of years, right? And he's evolved over that from like a person who was more of a conspiracy theorist into a person who now is just like largely a right-wing, not even that controversial alternative media person who, right, who that's what he is. He's not even that controversial in my opinion. He's just what it is. But this thing got in there. And remember, this is like, so Trump finally actually did run all the way for president in 2016 and he won. But he had floated the idea with, what the research committees in 2008 and 2012. And I think that this, whatever control system we're in yet, wasn't quite yet ready for Trump. People weren't yet disgusted enough with Alex Jones to take it to the next level with Trump. So they got it there with Alex Jones largely through like the Sandy Hook debacle, right? Because this idea of like hoaxed events really gets under the skin of people who who have children and things like that, right? And so they finally got it there, right, to a certain point. And so this time, like Trump, they run Trump, for something Trump runs. And now people are in this position where they don't ever, and it's been growing for a long time, but it was sort of like the Alex Jones effect leading up to this, to where any person who has a certain level of tastefulness in the way that they, in their own, like just their person or the way they deliver information, or because they have one idea you don't like, that it's okay to like not only throw the baby out with the bathwater, but like the whole world, right? Like that's pretty much like what we're doing at this point. Yeah. It's like we're dumping the whole world over out of like just a stylistic distaste for something almost, right? Because if you go and you look through all the crazy stuff, and you and I have talked about this before, all the crazy stuff Alex Jones has said, right? Like he delivers in a crazy manner. He's very hyper and rants on and whatever, but it's still like, maybe it's a little, I haven't watched in the last 3 or 4 years, so I can't say, but before that, it was still pretty much, 10 true things for every 1 or 2 not true things, right? So the truth quotient was much higher. And so like this weird thing happened where, and maybe there's some other examples of it, but like, people were willing to discard information in order to make sure that something they don't like is considered icky.
Yeah, I mean, I think
very childish.
It's it's childish and it's narcissistic because it's like, that hurts my feelings,
right?
So you can't do it. It's very heliocentric, right? Like
it's also, it offends my own sense of reality, and so because it offends my sense of reality, even if it's true, like I don't have to consider it
completely.
Yeah.
And I do see that happening, and I think that a lot of the like socially engineered SJW stuff has led up to it, like that whole snowflake culture. And what you're saying about Trump makes logical sense, but like let's not kid ourselves. Like, the globalists have gone after Trump like freaking psychopaths because they know that he's going to bring down their bullshit. And I'm not saying that Trump is the Messiah, and I'm not saying Trump is all good or anything like that, but like, that is why the freedom of speech is being pulled off. That's why Twitter started their fake news censorship back in 2016 when Pizzagate was emerging, which was Trump's whole thing was like, Hillary, you're going to prison. I'm draining the swamp. So I get what you're saying about Trump, but I mean, about Alex Jones,
Yeah.
but and I get how it would seem like it's a logical progression, but no, like they have been pointed and facing aggressively at taking him down from the get-go because he threatens to expose. They're all going to go to frickin' jail or be hung when they're exposed for the scumbags that they are.
So I think on a certain level, that's exactly right. Like there's like, because it's a multi-tiered sort of situation and game going on here. So on a certain level, that is exactly right. And then on another level, like there's benefits to having Trump as president, and to, because certain things can march along and people who would normally be opposed to them are accepting them because they're either they like Trump, or even if Trump isn't their favorite, they don't like what you're talking about, like the globalists doing that shit and whatever. So they'll defend certain things, like we get into this like trust the plan crap and stuff, right? Like, so like Trump is an interesting character because he's straddling two different levels, right? On a certain level, he is in bed with those same people, and on another level, he's opposing them. And I think I've talked about this maybe with you a little bit, certainly with Robert, that in a lot of ways, this is like factions, right? Like Trump is more like old school mafia. He's not really baby eater and child fucker. Like that's not his thing, right? But he's totally okay with being authoritarian, like, saying he has the right to decide for you what is okay. He's totally okay with, hooking up his buddies with, good deals so that they can make tons of money and shit like that. He's old school mafia.
Every politician on the planet.
Every politician, right? But he's just more classic, like mafia. He's not into like, interdimensional blood sucking. Right.
And he's not like Obama, where he's playing the role of a kind, noble person. He's just a no bullshit.
He's a troll. That's the biggest thing is he's like part of the reason that they have to censor, and this is more than any of the other things it does, is just because he is the best troll that has ever lived.
He's the best troll. Like
he's the best troll.
He me up like no one else.
Right. And so like whether you think that Trump is a good guy or whether you think that he is just like a front or like playing a role, that he's really still marching the boat, marching the troops the same way. What the problem with the globalists or the elite's problem with him is they don't see him as an appropriate steward of their boat. He doesn't, because he's embarrassing.
He's a direct threat to their boat. He's gonna sink their boat. He's very blatantly stated, I am going to take you guys down, as he has done and continues to do with China, with the pedophiles, like what's happening with Obama now. Like that's been super consistent. Like we can't, like it's the big white elephant in the room to like talk about like, yeah, it's this natural progression of censorship. It's like, no, he's trying to get rid of the cabal.
A portion of the cabal, certainly. A portion of the cabal. I don't think he's trying to return people to, what a free society should be. He's definitely not.
No, but when we're talking about why the powers that be are silencing him and silencing us and silencing Google and all of this, we cannot pretend that that's not why.
It's certainly a part of why. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's part of a lot of other stuff, but the distaste that a lot of people feel for him makes it easier for them to go along with the plans that they've had in place all along.
1,000,000%. But we also can't forget that the distaste that people have for him is being completely manipulated 1,000,000%. Like, I mean, I just tapped into a couple like mainstream Libby pieces this week, and they're like Saturday Night Live sketches to the extreme of how they disparage this person like feral 5-year-olds, you know, like feral little wolves. Like there's nothing like tasteful or ethical about the way that the mainstream news talks about this person. So I'm starting to understand why my fellow brothers and sisters who think they hate him act like such rabid psychopaths, because I see what they're being programmed with, and it's literal insanity.
This would never have been acceptable for the media to talk about Obama or Hillary Clinton or whatever. And this way even outdistances the way the left media ever talked about George Bush. They made fun of him a lot for being stupid and all that kind of stuff. So this way outdoes that. And I guess, like, you know, so it's just, to me, these people, Obama, Clinton, George Bush, Donald Trump, like, they're all very distasteful. But why is it okay to just absolutely go into insane clown world about one of them, right, and not the others? Like, when Obama was in office, this was happening in the alternative media. You were hearing people say the kinds of things about Obama that they say about Trump, but it was never covered like that in the mainstream, ever. Like every once in a while, you'd hear somebody on Fox News say something that was slightly disparaging of him as a human being. It's, you know, you'd hear things that were disparaging of his policies, but that was very rare and very mild compared to what happens constantly. Like, it is literally the media against this president. It isn't the media being adversarial and confrontational when they interview him for the sake of policy. It's always, you know, and like, to watch the way that they softball Joe Biden, right, and softball, you know, what, all of this stuff, and the way that they cover, the way that they just ignore the things that they don't like. It's obviously, it's obviously pointed at destroying Trump. You know what I mean? And I also think that was always part of the plan. So both things.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
But I do. You wanted to talk about Trump derangement syndrome in terms of people being unable to sort of accurately assess information.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm talking about now. So I feel like we're kind of in it, but it's just like, I'm not, you know, like, there's this idea that, like, well, let's just agree to disagree. Like, oh, you have different beliefs than I do. And like, that was okay until we started destroying our civil liberties and destroying the Constitution. And I'm noticing, and I'm really pulling back on my social media engagement because it's just not healthy. And it's, But what I've noticed is that the people who are hell-bent on buying into the sham and wanting our civil liberties ruined, they don't have the information and they're refusing to educate themselves on the information. And my thing is like, no, now we're not at a point where it's like, we believe differently and let's agree to disagree, because you're shitting on our Constitution and you're destroying our republic. So I feel like anyone who's lobbying for the rescinding of our civil liberties has a responsibility as a citizen and as a member of this republic to do their due diligence. And so I've been trying to figure out, where is that breakdown in that 100% of the people who are calling for the destruction of our civil liberties are also refusing to educate themselves. They can't be bothered to look at the information. I'm trying to figure out what that is. And I feel like Trump derangement syndrome is a big part of it.
That I 100% agree with. Like, if there's people, if any other person than Trump, right, were president right now and all of the same things were happening, people would not be as okay with this as they are. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Exactly. And
yeah, I do agree with you on that.
It's a very like reactive child. I would call it adolescent, but it's not. It's childish. It's like a toddler thing. Like, well, Trump likes vanilla, so I hate vanilla, and chocolate is the best, and vanilla should be outlawed. It's like,
yeah.
And I feel like that's the mindset that is supporting us, the momentum that is thrusting us into communist tyranny right now, and it really bums me out.
Yeah, so to me, like, what I see, and this is, I've had this with a couple people, to me, like, there's actually only one answer. Whatever you think the situation we're in right now is, right? Whether there is a virus or isn't a virus, and whether it's completely made up or it's only partially made up, blah, 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 whatever. Like, if you're scared or you're sick, stay home. And if you want to impose any more restrictions on people than that, then you have to look at the information. You have to understand what you're talking about, and you have to be willing to have conversations about it, right? Like, it's interesting how, like, you know, people will just say, no, I'm not interested in looking at that information. And also, I've also heard of situations where, like, you know, people want you to look at their information, but they won't look at yours, and they don't want to talk about either of them. They just want to email them to you, or right, like that kind of stuff. But it is just fascinating, you know. Like, I mean, and we've talked about this before, but communities that have always prided themselves on being counterculture have now proven themselves to just be order followers of, like, the highest magnitude, and inability to read or understand English. Like, I don't, like, it just, you know, like, if it's wrong, right, and this goes to the pandemic thing, right, because that's at the heart of a lot of this, right, if it's wrong, okay, so people will watch it and they'll do research and they'll go, okay, it's wrong, but it's there. But this idea that we can't have any wrong information, right? Like, let's just say that was the truth, that it was wrong, right? Like, people have been wrong since the beginning of the time. You know who's been wrong the most? Anthony Fauci. He's been wrong about everything, but we're still listening to him. And so even if Dr. Judy is wrong, like, why is it okay? Why is it less okay to listen to her be wrong than it is to listen all day, every day to Fauci be wrong?
Well, that's what I'm saying. And because, you know, Mickey, who made Plandemic, like, we've been friends and in the same community for 20 years. So I have an interesting window of seeing our mutual friends, our mutual collaborators, you know, people who we've all been at Burning Man together, been in ceremonies together, work on projects together. And I'm seeing them completely turn on him and shred him while refusing to talk about the facts, the statistics, the mammal parts and the heavy metals that she's referencing in the vaccines, Fauci's history. It's just this, like, salacious bullshit. And when I poke at it, because they're my friends, and I'm like, I'm not understanding why you won't look at the information. They're like, this could help Trump be elected. Like, I actually had a friend say that, and I was like, oh,
right.
That's what's inspiring this willful ignorance. But this willful ignorance, and again, like, you know, I'm in a constant evolutionary process and devoted to mastering my emotionalings and learning to be a more diplomatic speaker. So I'm wanting to understand and be more tolerant and be more compassionate, but I don't have compassion or tolerance for this willful ignorance when it leads to the destruction of our constitutional rights in our republic. It's lazy. It's not being a responsible citizen. It's destroying the very ideals upon which this country was founded. That laziness doesn't work right now.
Yeah, this goes to the same issue with, like, the Julian Assange thing, when people would say, like, a lot of the left found themselves in an uncomfortable position, and they used to, like, cover the Julian Assange stuff fairly, but when he put out the Podesta emails and the DNC leaks and things like that, then all of a sudden people were now anti-Julian Assange, and they say, well, he should have just waited till after the election, or why doesn't he release information on Trump? Right. And I fully believe that if Julian Assange had information on Trump, that he would have released it. Like, he actually hasn't been partisan.
No one has found dirt on Trump, and the DNC has put a lot of money into trying.
Well, and the other thing and this same thing goes to, like, when, like, people on the left get mad at James O'Keefe, right? Like, my whole thing has been like, well, okay, even though I wish he would sometimes expose so that we can share this information and it wouldn't be only one-sided, it makes me start to wonder why nobody who's a lefty hasn't put together a similar organization to investigate the right. And it makes me, so, like, as much as I, like, you know, is it laziness? Which it could be, because if these people are also too lazy to just look at the information and understand, it could be too lazy to put together anything that would actually benefit them. But, like, what is this? And so people,
mind control.
It's totally mind control. And so this is the whole thing, is, like, the only thing that I am biased towards is the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, right? Like, even, like, I can't tell you how many people that I like whether it be celebrities or athletes or at times politicians or whatever, that have proven to be the same pile of bullshit liars that that other ones that I always knew I didn't like are. And I live with that. It's not a different case when it's the person that I like.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so, but this, I think this is like one of the things that's happened with the way that like media and social media has become increasingly in control of our lives is this like, this development of like one's aesthetic tastes and the inability to like even tolerate in any way something that doesn't match that.
Exactly.
Right? Like
I don't like that information, so I'm not going to acknowledge it. I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist.
Right. Or I'll hear somebody say something like, I don't like the way that person talks, or there's something about the look of their, and I've said the same thing sometimes, but I also generally separate it from, like, you and I've had the conversation. There's something about the way Candace Owens talks that bothers me, so I have to listen to her in small doses.
For no reason.
Right. But I'm talking about something more that like is part of her oral function of speaking that I don't, that I don't like it, right? But that doesn't take away from the fact, and I think I don't, there's a lot of things I don't like about her, but that doesn't change the things that I think are very effective that she said. And I will go, I don't like this, but this was great. And I'm not going to say that that's not great because it was said by Candace Owens. If the thing she said is great, it's great. And that's it.
I think it goes back to what we were talking about last week, where like we continue to expect too much of humans, because I just think like for you to be able to hold that, to be able to hold, you know, and I have the same with Candace. I really don't like the way she speaks. And I think a lot of what she says is really important and valuable. And I think it takes a certain degree of expansion and integration to be able to hold those. But I think what's going on is more fundamental as far as how the mind control is shutting people down. Because I think if we broke it down, anyone who's wearing a mask is watching mainstream, is getting their news from the mainstream, 1,000,000%. And anyone who isn't is getting their news from independent sources. That's my guess.
There may be a slight, very tiny area of crossover in certain areas, but yeah, I think you're right. And this also circles back to, I just lost my train of thought. We were talking about Candace.
We started with Google.
Too many expectations. No, too many expectations. I just had like a brilliant thought, a brilliant point. You were talking about.
You're Emily Moyer.
You were talking about Candace.
Expecting too much of humans.
Expecting too much. I mean, at this point, I have almost no expectations. So how that can be too much, I don't know. But I think it was something you said right after that, and before the masks. You said it. Right in between.
I think people who are watching people who are wearing masks are the ones who are watching mainstream.
Right. So it was right between the thing before that and that. There was like 1 second there where you said something, and like my mind, I want to say, it's gone. Maybe it will come back, but it was good. It was good. But I know what it is. I know it. Circling back to Alex Jones, he had Matt Drudge on his show once, right? And Drudge Report has turned into a heaping pile of caca, but that's a separate issue. But one of the things Matt Drudge said is that how they're controlling people is by herding them into informational ghettos, right? And that's what social media has done. And so, like, you've been pointed towards constantly this one thing, like they see sort of what your tendencies are, and then they start refining it and pointing you into this thing where, like, that becomes the only flavor you like, right? And then there's like 20 or 30 of these different ghettos, and you can't tolerate like any of the activities that are going on in the other ghetto. It's kind of like, when you just whatever, like people who get fixated on only ever eating one flavor of ice cream, and it's a threat to their whole reality, right? And he was right about that. That was the problem with social media. That is the problem, is the way it funnels people into a ghetto for their own informational comfort kind of thing. And then anything that isn't exactly that is not only not what they don't like, it's intolerable. It's like having a peanut allergy to it. It's like you're going to go into anaphylactic shock. That's what's happening, is all these people that are doing the Trump derangement system. It's like they got a little taste of peanut butter and they're in anaphylactic shock or something like that, right? Remember when nobody had that, when nobody had a peanut allergy? And now it's like
people didn't have that.
Right.
But also, I mean, you look at the GMOs and Monsanto and the soy and the BPAs and like the vaccines that we did not have as kids. Like, I'm sure all of those are contributing.
But also just this idea that if we have a sensitivity to something, we should avoid it rather than build up a tolerance to it.
But that goes back to this whole like helicopter parenting, SJW shit, social the like virtue signaling with the mask. The other thing that I'm seeing, and we didn't talk about talking about this today, is the meaning that the mainstream media is programming people to make of people who don't wear masks. Because I'm noticing the people who are really pro-mask are like, well, you not wearing a mask is selfish, and you not wearing a mask says that you don't care if I die. And it's like, no, it doesn't actually mean that. You're being indoctrinated to say that means that, but there are so many leaps of illogic in there. And if that's the mindset, or it's not even the mindset, because when I say mindset, it indicates that there's some sort of independent thinking, and there isn't. There isn't. So, but it's that meaning making that's being attached to it and indoctrinated that has this, because I mean, I had a really rough week last week as far as being thrown out of an outdoor nursery for not making a mask and ganged up on by 3 people. And it was really freaking scary. And the meaning that was being made as far as like basically accusing me of being a murderer, that's coming from that mainstream engineering around this.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's no doubt about that. Right. And it's
of it. Like my choice to leave the house as a free person has anything to do with you and your silly engineered fear. I'm not thinking of you at all. I'm living my life. Yeah. That's the whole SJW thing.
This is the whole thing. And this goes for this situation as well as many, many others. When I circle back to saying, really the only thing we should be saying, that should be being said here is, if you're sick or you're scared, stay home. And that's it. Everything.
Do what you need to do.
If anything that goes beyond that, is against logic, against science, against reality. You know what I mean? And you know, like, it needs to be questioned, right? Yeah. Like anything further than that at this point, because if you believe that masks work, then you are wearing one should prevent, right? If you believe vaccines work, then your having one should be fine. And if you believe that social distancing or staying at home works, then you're free to do that. So go ahead, right? You know, I like that. And that's just the end of it. So.
The thing, it's so obvious. Like, why is there even a conversation? The 3 people who ganged up on me at the outdoor nursery were all making masks, and the guy's like, "You're making my employees feel unsafe," and I'm like, "I'm not coughing on, like, you're all wearing masks. What is going to happen with logic?" But there's no logic left.
That's logic.
Mind control has taken the logic and put it in the toilet.
And this one is like all the other ones. Like, we're good for a certain level of this, but because people have a huge fear of death, and you inject fear into otherwise illogical stuff, then it just blows it over. And it's just like people running around like with not even, like, they don't even stop to think for 1 second if what they're saying or what they're doing makes any sense. Have you seen that video of the guy, "I wear my mask in the car"?
Yes! So good. I loved it.
That's exactly what it is, though. Like, it's exactly that.
It's just an extension of the virtue signaling. It's like the dude wearing the "future is female" shirt to get pussy. It's the same thing. Same mindset.
Same mindset.
Just to circle back to your Google thing, because I didn't mean to take us away from that.
There wasn't much more to say about it. It was just,
But I also think it's important, and I know our audience probably knows this, but again, like, Google has donated millions and millions of dollars to Wikipedia. And I see so many people who fight for their dumb indoctrination citing Wikipedia as though it's a legitimate fact-checking source. And I was working on another project, and I looked up Margaret Sanger's Wikipedia, and they were saying, like, well, yes, she was a eugenicist, but it was never racially biased. And then I found her Negro Project, where she's like, they can't know that our aim is to exterminate the Negroes. And I'm like, why are there 5 paragraphs on Wikipedia going off on how none of this was racially motivated when...
Because they have figured out that most people will never click on the links. Most people will never look any deeper. And so, that's exactly...
Right.
Yeah.
But just to, like, tie into, like, of course Google's censoring us. Of course, they're revving everything up now because it's total go time. It's all about the vax, which is the next thing that I'd love to talk about. This crazy, I already forgot what it's called. Midnight. I'm gonna have to look it up.
The midnight I just watched it.
I don't know why I never remember the name of this.
The thing was that the episode was called Officers and Wolves, I think, but I can't remember.
That was with
Midnight Gospel. The Midnight Gospel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a brand new Netflix show, animated. I think it's created by Duncan Trussell, who's like a comedian, Buddhist, something.
Joe Rogan, hanger on her. Yeah. Yeah.
So Ross was really excited to show me this show, and we watched this episode, and the way the show works, it's just like this conversation between Duncan and whoever the guest is, and it's generally like some sort of like spiritual or esoteric metaphysical exploration, and then it's this like very low rent psychedelic animation that kind of, but not really, has anything to do with what they're talking about, just going on in the background. And in this particular episode, there were multiple instances of, out of nowhere, these needles just appearing in the animation, these hypodermic needles injecting the characters as they spoke, and I found it extremely disturbing.
Well, it's also, there was that, but there was, aside from just these exact needles, there was tons of things that were pointed tips, or like pointed to the idea of penetration, right? Like, and to me, the kind of combination of this symbolism that you're talking about with this talking about the psycho spiritual stuff, right? And then this woman talking about like her familiarity with dealing with death, right? So this is putting together all this stuff, is trying to create a comfort level with penetration, because that's what the whole aim of everything is right now, is penetrating from a space that, for penetrating into a space that does not belong to you, right? That's what this whole thing is about. Okay.
Which is the definition of rape, P.S.
Right. And using people's fear of death to get them to be okay with it. And having Duncan trust, like this whole thing, like think about the way people who, like, you know, he's obviously connected to Joe Rogan, and they even referred to the Joe Rogan podcast, I think. In the
I didn't know that.
Maybe they didn't. But we talked about Joey Diaz, right? So it's Duncan Trussell. So by proxy, it's a reference to the whole Joe Rogan game. Look at what Joe Rogan has done. He's taken people who, like, when his podcast started, it was super into, you know, the psychedelic space and questioning reality and questioning the authority and stuff like that. And now Joe Rogan is a vaccine pusher, right? And they have Duncan Trussell and Eddie Bravo and people who are friends of Joe Rogan's, for those who are still not ready to quite go along with the authoritative thing that Joe Rogan is pushing. So they'll branch off and go listen to Duncan Trussell's podcast or something like that. And now they're watching his cartoon and he's doing his thing. And so they're inserting these ideas everywhere. Like, you know, and this is where, like, they've always wanted to sort of use the psychedelic or spiritual space as a way to sort of trick people into transhumanism or this kind of stuff. And like a person, you know, who, like, to me made that bridge really obvious is someone like Joe Rogan, but in another way it was like a Jason Silva, right? Because he'll go on in like a Terrence McKenna kind of way, but then he also likes the idea of uploading his consciousness to a computer chip. And he sort of bridged that gap. And I have no idea what his stance is on vaccines, but like at some point, you know, because there is like this, obviously like this high technological futuristic part of the psychedelic experience, right? Like that doesn't mean that like all of this other stuff that sort of sounds like it and sort of goes along with it is okay. If like the psychedelic space, you don't have to do anything to your body to experience that. Right? You're just there and you're seeing it and you're seeing how it works. And if you're really clever and smart, you can find ways to pull that back into your normal life and work that thing, right? Because nature is like the highest form of ancient technology that is also beautiful and productive, right? You know, and so this idea that we have to do something to change ourselves, to move us from the idea we had in the psychedelic space to being able to actualize that, I think is really like the message there. Right. And the only way to do that is to poke through. Right.
Right. Well, I want to take that in, because what I was getting from it is like this Duncan Trussell show, Midnight Gospel, it launched on 4/20. So it's obviously angling itself towards
Stoners.
people who are choosing to intoxicate their consciousness. And it's the type of show that, like, okay, someone's going to smoke a bowl before watching or take some mushrooms or whatnot. It's super psychedelic. And I feel like there's a vulnerability in that space and an openness, and the blatant programming with those images. Like, I was thinking, because I'm so sensitive, like, I go to a movie where there's any violence or anything and I'm like, you know, like my nervous system just feels it. And anytime I saw those needles, I was like, I cannot think of any time in my history of watching movies, watching television, where I've been bombarded with that needle. Like Pulp Fiction, but that was sort of over the top, you know, when they gave her the one in the heart, and it was really intense. But I really cannot think of other instances where that images was burned in, because it feels almost like anti-life, sacrilegious. There's something about it that's like not okay. And that happened so many times in this episode of Midnight Gospel that I was like, there's no way that the animator, that this was part of his organic creative process. I don't buy that. Listening to this conversation about death between Anne Lamott and Duncan Trussell, I don't see where these hypodermic needles stabbing the characters would authentically come forth from the animator's imagination. So my sense is that it's contractually obligated by Netflix, who did push out the Bill Gates Vax documentary. And I have calls into some Netflix people now, and I'm, you know, who knows what if they'll tell me, but like, I don't buy for a minute that emerged organically. I feel like that they are imposing that upon their creators. That's my sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that the Obamas are creating things with them. I know that Susan Rice is on the board at Netflix and whatnot. But this whole situation that we're in right now is about creating an opening for something that would normally not be accepted to be accepted, whether that be through using certain technologies to weaken the cell wall so that frequencies can get in there, or so that they can use a vaccine that does the same thing, so things that aren't supposed to pass the cell wall can get in there, or even if that goes to your mind. So they know that the people who like Duncan Trussell are going to smoke a bowl and watch this, and that's going to open their mind to this idea of the right. But the whole thing is about openings and penetration, penetrating, like creating an opening and then penetrating. Because I saw things that look like penises in there too, right? So it isn't just about only the needle. It's about the overall act of opening to penetration, openings and penetration, right? They want to penetrate. They're going to create an opening. This whole thing we're in right now is they're creating an opening for tyranny by scaring people, which is how they always do it, right? I love David Martin's point that you're dealing with bullshit propaganda if you are being made to feel scared and shame. The shame by like, you don't know, you're not smart enough to understand this, and also if they're using fear and shame, you're listening to propaganda, right?
Yeah, that video that you're referencing, I felt like was one of David Martin's strongest, and it was totally true. Like, these people, like, fear, because he said fear is always manipulated. Like, you know, you're in a manipulated state and you're being indoctrinated when your media is putting you in fear.
Yep.
It's so clear. And I'm really excited for humans to pick up on that.
Yeah.
The other piece I want to mention was, because I hadn't made the Joe Rogan connection, and you're completely spot on. I follow, you know who Aubrey Marcus is? Okay. So Aubrey Marcus, you know, he stepped down from On It, which he started with it. You know, Joe Rogan is a partnership. And I saw him post something last week that was like, you know, I was all on board that like this was a sham and this wasn't real. And now both my parents have COVID-19. And my immediate thought was like, Joe Rogan, you're part of that Joe Rogan mind control crew. Like, you know, like now I feel like Joe Rogan is shorthand for mind control.
Right. So is On It. You're on it. You're on the mind control, right? Yeah. Like the way that Aubrey Marcus has set up himself as like a lifestyle design brander kind of thing, like with the nootropics and the exercise stuff and the psychedelic stuff, you know, whatever. I didn't know he'd step down. Robert and I have talked about on some mashes about Aubrey Marcus. There's also somebody about, it was like last year, I can't remember the kid's name, but this was when it was that same period of time when when Robert and I started speaking out quite a bit about Joe. Somebody did a deep dive into the background of Aubrey Marcus's father. Like it's the whole thing.
Flashlight founder.
But the whole thing, on it is if you're on it, you're on it, dude. You're on mind control. Right. I remember when On It first came out and they just had like those capsules that were for like roll on and roll off for like if you did ecstasy at parties and shit like that. So they've rolled the people who came from the party scene, right, and the psychedelic scene into this like UFC, mixed martial arts, certain kind of health food, keto diet, maybe carnivore diet, it's
also like ayahuasca, polyamory.
Totally. Ayahuasca, we talked about that in terms of the ayahuasca, but there's like a whole lifestyle built for them, right? And just think about like what Joe Rogan has done to like an entire generation of men of a certain age, right? Like, and how he, he whipped them. Like I get really offended when I see him do those episodes where he's like wearing like the NASA suits and stuff like that, right? Because it's like now he's making fun of people who question NASA when that was what he sort of built a lot of his base and stuff on. So it's creating this huge amount of like cognitive dissonance, right, and whatnot. And there's always the it's like a full-fledged program. It's got like the mind control part. It's got the psychedelics, the exercise, the food, the informational aspect of it. And then,
did you hear his new Elon Musk interview?
I heard a few of the little clips.
It's offensive how obvious it is clearly pro-transhumanism propaganda. It's repulsive.
Yeah. So Aubrey Marcus is part of that whole thing. I remember I heard that very first time he had Aubrey Marcus on the podcast, and it was awesome. It sounded amazing. And just the fact that like this is where it's been whipped into, like this is the place that all of that was like leading and going. And I question, even though he's like more conspiratorial, he like takes it to a goonish level, right? Eddie Bravo. And of course, Eddie Bravo owns 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, where everybody's going for their martial arts training who watches the Joe Rogan podcast, and they have outlets in every big city around the country and whatnot. And so this also goes to that show that Sophia and I did about like CrossFit and mind control and whatever. The same thing goes on with this, like it's very. We live in an awfully fucking strange world. And I was talking I had a guest on the show, won't be out for like a week and a half or 2 weeks probably, but we were talking about like, is Joe Rogan a CIA agent masquerading as a comedian? Or I said, or is it vice versa? I see a comedian masquerading as a CIA agent. That's the kind of flip-flop, upside down, backward world we live in.
So that's interesting, because I know that like when you and Robert had first started talking about this, the idea that you were dancing around was more that he was MK, and did he know or does he not know? But it is pretty obvious with the like hardcore vax pushing. I mean, he's changed. It feels like he's changed quite a bit in the past like 4 or 5 months of just.
Well, he wants people to make it. He's the person who's making it seem uncool to question vaccinations, right? That's what his part is. Like, vaxxer, anti-vaxxer, like the question of whether you're cool doesn't come into it very, very much. But like him saying it, there's this whole generation of men that should be like defenders of something that are now like, oh, but dude, the guy I look up to, he's kind of into it. So like, even though normally I would defend somebody's right for something, man, I don't want to look uncool because I just did ayahuasca with these guys, whatever the fuck it is, right? It's a really interesting kind of massively social peer pressure.
This is all giant, massively social. Yeah. It's all a freaking trend, and it has been a trend
for a long time.
Soros started. A long time. Yeah, exactly.
For a long time. Yeah. It's the Joe Rogan thing is like such a conundrum, right? Because like there's a lot of people who've found their way to a lot of truth through being initiated first through Joe Rogan into like podcasts and alternative information, right? Like I had another guest on it. The show's going to come out in the next couple of days. It's like a health person, right? But he first obviously heard about carnivore diet from Sean Baker on the Joe Rogan podcast, right? So he's taken that and moved it as into he was working in the health field long before that, but he's rolled information, I'm sure, on that and many other topics that he got there into something that is real and important and true, right? But for a lot of people, like, I wonder how many people who've been following Joe Rogan from the very beginning, like, are right in lockstep with him and what he believes now, right? I know that there's a lot of people who jumped off and whatever, but I would be curious to see how many have just gone along for the full evolution and are in complete lockstep with it. And I bet you it's a pretty high number.
Yeah, my guess is that it's a disturbingly high number, also because it feels like it's like the frogs who are slowly boiling to death. Mm-hmm. Like, it's been very strategic the way that Joe has like pulled back on pretending to not know some things he knows and changing his mind on some things. Like, it's gradual, where now it's pretty obvious. But for people who've been listening the whole time, my guess is most of them haven't noticed.
And the truth of the matter is not most people, and this is not a criticism of people for this, because everybody has lives to live and things that they're doing. Most people don't listen to as much media as you or I do. So a lot of people only have time to maybe listen to one podcast a day. And so, like, they're not listening to opposing information, and it may not even be because they're not curious, just because, like, shit, I have 4 kids, and like, there was a guy that ate at the restaurant I used to work at who would come in to eat once a week by himself so he could have time to listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. He was super busy. He had 2 kids. He owned his own business. You know what I mean? Like, all this kind of, his work involved traveling and whatnot. So he would come in so he could eat by himself and listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. That person doesn't have time to be listening to other things that are opposing. And he thinks he's getting information that isn't mainstream media, right? That seems sort of edgy and cool and alternative in nature. And this is what he's getting. He's getting a long-term shaping of his mind.
Yeah, exactly.
And he believes he's questioning reality by listening to Joe Rogan.
No, it's really a bummer.
It's a bummer. It's hard. Like, there are some really cool things going on in the world. Like, I'm certainly experiencing some neat stuff, but there's definitely, over the last week and a half, been a lot more days of like, man, this is a bummer in some cases than it's been like, oh, this is kind of exciting. Although I've had those moments as well. I don't know, man. I'm also just fatigued of this. Like, I'm bored of talking about all these things related to this. If I just see the word COVID, I should cut that out because I don't even want to say it. But I just, like, that is a mind control word. That is not a real word.
It's not a word.
Like, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. It's loaded with dangerous shit. I got in trouble at this online business school over the weekend through a Kundalini school because one of the teachers was talking about all the dangers of this fake pandemic. And in the chat box, I'm like, this is total propaganda. And
what happened?
And someone was like, well, why don't you open your mind instead of giving it labels? And I was like, because he's parroting mainstream propaganda to a school full of hundreds of people, which is pretty much the definition of propaganda. And then the big giant, influencer guru who was running the whole thing came on the chat and was like, you need to stop disrespecting my teacher, in all caps, Dani, and like totally shame me. And it was weird.
Why do you think so many people in like the spiritual or like alternative wellness community, like there's a lot that are buying it, like particularly a lot who are into sort of like yoga and tantric yoga and things like that. Like they're good on the part that we should have alternative methods for treating it and whatnot. Like I hear some of that from people, but they think this is a real thing to be feared and blah, blah, blah. Why do you think that is?
I think it goes back to the Trump derangement syndrome, because I noticed, like, and I've been having this conversation with other people online of like all these spiritual look at Marianne Williamson's presidential campaign and how much time she spent totally disparaging and talking shit about Trump, where I was like, have you read your Course in Miracles? Are you familiar with your body of work? It's so weird to me that these spiritual teachers, like I've heard Matt Kahn do it. I heard Barbara Handclough do it. It's like love and light and unity consciousness, except for Trump. And that syndrome is infecting the spiritual community as well.
So I get what you're saying. I'm thinking of a particular person, maybe more than one of them even, but a particular person who I've never heard ever say anything about anything political or about Trump at all. Right? This person is into all sorts of alternative wellness, healing, yoga, tantra.
I want to
know. You don't know this person. It's a person from private life, right? So this isn't a person I've never heard I've never heard the word Trump out of this person's mouth ever.
Okay.
but he is convinced that there is this horrible pandemic, you know, and that it really is
watching
good,
mainstream
it
news?
really is good for everybody to wear a mask and be in their house and to sanitize everything and whatever. And I'm just wondering how, like, this is a person who's keyed in and on it with so many things, and you know what I mean. And
is he a virtue signaler?
Not at all. He hates that.
Does he watch mainstream news?
I don't think so.
Is he living a fulfilled life? Because this is the other piece.
Yes. This is a very, in my opinion, in almost every case, emotionally settled, grounded, happy person that feels good about themselves, that treats people well. It's weird. The only thing I can think of is that in some people's heritage, their genetics, right? Like if their people have been the victim of some kind of plague before, then the idea that exists, it like excites something in their nervous system, right? Because this person is an indigenous person.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of indigenous people here in New Mexico are buying into it. And when it started, I was like, oh, cool. Well, let's have all of the native tribes here just shut this down and be like, this is our land.
They're super into it, dude.
And they're super into it.
So I'm wondering if, like, because
does he eat sugar? Because I think it's also the diet. The indigenous community here in general has a super shit diet, and we know how much of that is programmable. But I think it might simply be the mind control. The reason why I spoke up in the online business school, where I was like, this is propaganda, and she was like, you need to shut up. And I was like, your teacher is spreading very toxic, dangerous mind control, is that I clued in early on that like you said, you want to cut out COVID-19 from this, and I get why. That is an infectious, toxic virus in the name. So are these people who we have higher hopes for, were they just in the line of fire as these words were being bandied about?
Yeah, like the vibration of the word just repatterned the brain. Yeah. So
exactly.
just back to this. So no, this person definitely does not consume sugar. My point about, and I do like what David Martin said. He doesn't call them indigenous communities. He calls them communities of persistence. I kind of like that.
Communities of persistence.
Yeah, that have been around for a really long time, despite all of the things that have gone on and whatever, right? And that still adhere to some of their traditional ways, or all of their traditional ways in some cases. But what I'm wondering is if, like, because of some of the plagues of the past, right, or pandemics, were things that were used to like take out certain groups of people, right, intentionally, like on blankets passed out to natives and whatever, or that kind of stuff, right? If there's something that is like embedded in their genetics that like remembers that and that is fearful of that, and so that's their response, because this person doesn't have any of those classifications that would make him generally subject to this, right?
I hear what you're saying, and I get it from an epigenetic standpoint, but I feel like there's something coming through in the lexicon, in the words, and in the communication that's activating it, because we're Jews.
Activating the dormant fear.
Exactly. And kicking on that, that's in the genes. Something is being transmitted in the conversation around it. It's like because I clued in really quickly on this one. There's some things that are gross and mind controlling where I can still tap into how the mainstream is talking about it and stay sovereign. And I clued in like in February when people were talking about this, turn it off.
Yeah.
Don't listen. Do not listen. So I feel like it might be a matter of listening to one piece too many, to one news story too much, because it is being transmitted through the words.
Yeah. Yeah. I got you. That makes sense. All right. I think we need to wrap it up, because I think you have a hard out.
Yeah. Did we cover everything? Do you feel complete on the Google piece as well?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I was just curious if you also hadn't seen this, so I was just kind of curious and whatnot. And I am interested if there is any good search engine out there that, I don't care what order, like for me, it doesn't matter if they have a preference of information. It just matters to me if the information is actually there. I will find it. I know how to comb through it.
Yeah, maybe someone listening can clue us in as far as like what is the most clean, objective, uncompromised search engine.
Yeah, but I do think, like, so when I've asked a couple people, they're just like, oh, I just use the dark web. You know what I mean? And so that may be where
Can
this
you
is
and I
all.
access the dark web?
I think you have to install something on your computer to be able to do it. So I'm not tech enough to do that. Somebody would have to help me. But I guess information is becoming just as illicit as all the other things that go on the dark web. So anywho, all right, that's going to wrap it up for us. You can find various types of coaching and assistance from either one of us at our various locations on the internet. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another wonderful conversation. I'll see you later.
Thanks, Emily.